As I stepped outside with my dog's leash in hand, ready for a brisk walk, the early morning buzz of the neighborhood greeted me. Cars roared to life as my neighbors set off to work. I glanced over, noting the usual routines, but kept my focus sharp. My time wasn't wasted on rushing to someone else's office. I had my own plans to work on, plans that would ensure I'd rise back to the top. From across the street, Ethan's presence was hard to miss. His pristine driveway showcased a brand-new black sports car, yet another flashy addition from his car import business. He strolled over with his characteristic swagger, flashing a grin that seemed to scream self-satisfaction. "Morning," he called out, his tone overly cheery. "Morning, Ethan," I replied, my tone calm but firm. His grin widened as he added, "Must be nice having all this time to relax. No commute, no stress, huh?" I raised an eyebrow, unfazed by his attempt to provoke me. "Every day has its challenges, Ethan. Relaxation isn't always part of the plan." He chuckled, clearly dismissive. "Well, I've got cars to import. Busy day ahead," he said, walking back toward his flashy vehicle. I watched him leave without a second thought, turning back to my walk. Men like Ethan thrived on comparing themselves to others. I didn't have the patience for that kind of small-mindedness. My focus was on rebuilding, not entertaining petty digs. When I returned home, the atmosphere inside was noticeably colder. Not because of the temperature, but because of Vanessa. My wife had changed over the years, and not for the better. Once a warm and loving partner, Vanessa now carried herself with an air of indifference. Her role as an insurance agent seemed to fuel her constant preoccupation, leaving little room for anything or anyone else. She no longer greeted me with enthusiasm, no longer cared to ask about my plans or my day. I'd grown accustomed to her aloofness, but I wasn't about to let it define how I lived. I walked past her as she sat hunched over her laptop, papers strewn across the table. "Vanessa," I said, my voice steady. She barely glanced up. "Do you even remember the last time we had a real conversation?" Her reply came curtly. "Things change." She didn't bother to elaborate, her attention snapping back to her work. Later that evening, I decided it was time to address the growing rift between us head-on. Vanessa returned from work, immediately parking herself at her laptop again. I didn't waste time tiptoeing around the issue. "Vanessa," I said, standing firm. She looked up irritated. "Do you even remember who we were before? The times we shared before all of this?" She folded her arms. "What's your point?" "I miss what we had," I said bluntly, "but I'm not about to spend my life chasing after someone who doesn't care. I've been patient, but patience has its limits." She sighed heavily, shutting her laptop with a loud thud. "Look, I don't have time to sit around and talk about the past. I'm busy trying to manage everything." I held her gaze, unwavering. "We're both busy, Vanessa. The difference is I make time for the things that matter." Her tone hardened. "Times have changed. I have responsibilities, real ones. I can't waste my energy reminiscing about things that don't matter anymore." I nodded, my voice calm but resolute. "Then let's be clear. I'm not asking you for anything you're unwilling to give. But don't expect me to keep waiting around while you prioritize everything but this marriage." Her eyes flashed with anger, but she said nothing. I didn't need her response. Her silence spoke volumes. The next morning, I headed to the park with my dog, the crisp air sharpening my focus. Vanessa's indifference didn't weaken me. It only solidified my resolve to push forward, with or without her. My goals weren't contingent on her support, and they certainly weren't hindered by her lack of respect. As I walked, I ran through my plans, mentally organizing the steps needed to reclaim my success. When I returned home, Vanessa was at her dressing table, meticulously applying lipstick. Her reflection in the mirror caught my attention, but I said nothing at first, observing as she fussed over her appearance. "You're putting in a lot of effort," I remarked casually. Without looking at me, she smiled at her reflection. "I am beautiful, aren't I?" she said, her voice laced with vanity. I stepped closer, leaning against the doorframe. "Who's all that effort for, Vanessa?" My tone was even, but the implication was clear. She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you trying to say?" I'm saying that maybe if you spent half as much energy on us as you do on your reflection, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Her expression hardened, but I didn't wait for her response. Turning on my heel, I walked away. There was no point in arguing with someone who refused to acknowledge the problem. As Vanessa glanced at me, her eyes carried the same mix of irritation and defiance I'd come to expect. "Around 7, I think," she answered curtly. I nodded, a slight smirk playing at my lips. "Good to know," I replied casually before adding, "Just thought I'd ask." My tone was light, but my mind was already working. I had a plan for tonight, a home-cooked dinner, complete with her favorite wine. It wasn't about desperation. It was about showing that I was still willing to put effort into what we had, even if she wasn't. The rest of the day was mine to make productive. With upbeat music playing in the background, I tidied up the house, turning it into a space that radiated warmth and order. I didn't need chaos around me. Everything I touched was a small act of control in a world that demanded order. By the time I stepped back and surveyed the clean counters and polished floors, I felt a sense of satisfaction. I made a quick trip to the grocery store, selecting the best ingredients for the dinner I had planned. As I picked up the last of the vegetables, an idea struck me. I'd stop by the wine store for her favorite bottle of rose. It was a detail I couldn't overlook. The familiar chime of the store's doorbell greeted me, followed by the enthusiastic voice of Pam, the saleswoman. "Well, if it isn't Robert." "Long time no see," she said with a wide smile. "Hey, Pam," I said evenly, returning her greeting. "I'm doing just fine, thanks. Do you have a bottle of that rose Vanessa likes?" Pam's eyebrows lifted slightly, a playful smile tugging at her lips. "Planning a romantic evening at home?" "Huh," she teased. I chuckled lightly, meeting her gaze. "Something like that." Pam nodded and turned toward the shelf, but her next comment caught my attention. "Funny thing, Vanessa was in here earlier, picked up the same bottle." The words hung in the air for a moment. Pam's smile faltered slightly, as if she realized she'd said too much. "Maybe she's planning her own surprise for you," she added hastily, clearing her throat. I said nothing, but the wheels in my mind were already turning. Vanessa, buying wine earlier today? Why hadn't she mentioned it? I gave Pam a polite nod as she wrapped the bottle for me and handed it over. The drive home was quiet, the bottle of wine resting in the passenger seat. My thoughts were anything but still. Was Vanessa planning something? If so, why keep it a secret? Or was there another explanation? The possibilities swirled in my mind, but I pushed them aside. I'd find out soon enough. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the house was bathed in the warm light of evening. Inside, the aroma of dinner filled the air as I finished preparing the meal. The table was set for two, every detail perfect. I glanced at the clock. 7:45. Vanessa was usually punctual, but tonight there was no sign of her. I checked my phone periodically, hoping for a message. Nothing. By 8:30, the silence was broken by her ringtone. I answered immediately. "Hey," I said, my tone calm but firm. "Where are you?" Vanessa's voice came through, rushed and breathless. "I'm so sorry, Robert. An unexpected business trip came up. My boss insisted. I had no choice." Her words were smooth, almost rehearsed. "You're leaving now?" I asked, holding my composure. "I'm already on my way there," she replied, sounding almost annoyed. "It's a big opportunity, Robert. It could open doors for me." I paused for a moment, then spoke evenly. "You should have told me sooner, Vanessa. I'm not a mind reader." I know," she said quickly. "It all happened so fast. I didn't have time to explain." "You didn't have time? Or you didn't think to?" My voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the edge in my tone. "I have to go," she said, her impatience evident. "I'll be back soon, maybe 2 weeks or so." "Fine," I said, my tone firm. "Let me know when you land." The call ended abruptly, leaving me in the quiet dining room, the beautifully set table before me. I didn't sink into my chair or wallow in disappointment. Instead, I stood there, piecing together the events of the day. The wine purchase, the sudden trip, the rushed explanation, it didn't add up. And I wasn't the type to ignore what didn't make sense. If Vanessa thought I wasn't paying attention, she was mistaken. I would find out the truth, one way or another. The aroma of the meal I had prepared lingered in the air, but I refused to let the evening's events dampen my resolve. A perfectly good dinner was set before me, and I wasn't about to let it go to waste. With deliberate calm, I plated the food and moved to the living room. Switching on the TV, I let the flickering glow fill the space as the sound of a live game brought the room to life. I leaned back on the couch, letting the excitement of the game draw me in. It wasn't about avoiding the situation. It was about staying sharp and focused. A little distraction was often the best way to clear the mind. As the game unfolded, I found myself chuckling at the commentary and the occasional blunder on the field. When my glass ran dry, I headed to the kitchen to pour another. But as I passed the study, a faint glow caught my eye. The computer screen was lit. Vanessa rarely left it on, and notifications didn't typically wake it unless there was activity. My curiosity piqued. I stepped into the study and switched on the overhead light. At first, I figured it was a glitch, maybe a notification popping up at random. I almost turned away when a sound from the computer stopped me in my tracks. A small pop-up appeared in the corner of the screen. Photos successfully synced. I frowned and leaned closer. Clicking on the notification, I waited as the screen loaded. A list of files appeared, all time-stamped just hours earlier. My instincts told me something wasn't right, but I wasn't one to jump to conclusions. Clicking the first file, I watched as the image began to load. The picture revealed itself gradually, but the face was unmistakable. Vanessa! She was smiling playfully, her pose casual but intimate. By the time the image fully loaded, I could see why. She wasn't alone. She was seated on a man's lap, her boss, no doubt, and they both looked far too comfortable. I didn't flinch. Instead, I studied the photo for a moment, taking in every detail. The angle, the lighting, the way she leaned into him. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a declaration. Exiting the photo, I opened the next. The sequence continued, each picture worse than the last. The two of them at a sleek bar, laughing, toasting, and leaning in close during what looked like an intimate conversation. The truth was no longer in question. Vanessa hadn't just grown distant. She had made her choice. Shutting the computer, I stood there for a moment, the weight of the discovery settling on my shoulders. There was no anger yet, only clarity. The dinner I had prepared, the efforts to salvage what we once had, they felt distant now, like remnants of a plan I no longer needed to follow. Back in the living room, I poured myself another drink but didn't touch it. My mind was already racing ahead, planning my next move. I wasn't the kind of man who crumbled under betrayal. No, I was the kind who confronted it head-on. The rain had started outside, light droplets tapping against the windows. Grabbing my coat, I decided to step out. There was no need to stay cooped up in that house any longer. The liquor store was a short walk away. As I pushed the door open, the warmth of the shop greeted me, a stark contrast to the chill of the night. Pam, the saleswoman, looked up from the counter and smiled, but it faltered slightly when she saw my expression. "Rough night?" she asked, her tone cautious. "You could say that," I replied, my voice even. Pam nodded, pulling out a familiar bottle of whiskey. "This one usually helps," she said, sliding it across the counter. I took the bottle, pausing for a moment before speaking. "Pam, can I ask you something?" She hesitated but nodded. "Sure. You mentioned earlier that Vanessa stopped by. Did she say what the wine was for?" Pam's eyes darted away briefly. "Not really, just said it was for a special occasion." I nodded, reading between the lines. Pam didn't need to spell it out. Vanessa's special occasion wasn't with me. I paid for the bottle, thanking Pam before heading back out into the rain. The cold droplets didn't bother me. They only sharpened my focus. Vanessa thought she could play games without consequences, but she was wrong. As I walked back home, bottle in hand, a sense of determination settled over me. I wasn't a man to be lied to or manipulated. Vanessa had made her choices, and now it was time for me to make mine. Pam's gentle concern didn't faze me. "Rough night?" she asked cautiously, her tone hinting at an offer to listen. I kept my voice even. "Whiskey," I said simply, my tone leaving no room for further conversation. She hesitated, but sensing my mood, she handed me the bottle. "If you ever need someone to talk to—" "Thanks," I interrupted, offering a faint smile before walking out. The cold night air bit at my face as I opened the bottle and took a measured swig. I wasn't drinking to drown my emotions. I was drinking to remind myself of the bitter truth staring me in the face. Each sip was a grim acknowledgement of what Vanessa had done. As I walked down the street, the rain began to pick up. A few passersby glanced at me as I passed, their curious expressions lingering. One man's stare lingered too long, and I shot him a pointed look. "You know Vanessa?" I asked, my tone sharper than intended. "She's probably out having a great time while I'm here celebrating her freedom." The man quickly looked away, and I let out a bitter laugh. I wasn't looking for sympathy. I wanted clarity, and I would get it on my terms. I kept walking, each step purposeful despite the whiskey warming my veins. At some point, I noticed an older man leaning against a lamppost, his worn backpack slung over one shoulder. He watched me with a mixture of curiosity and concern. His quiet gaze wasn't one of judgment, but understanding. "What are you looking at?" I said sharply, my tone challenging. But as he met my eyes, something about his calm demeanor made my anger waver. "Sorry," I muttered, running a hand through my damp hair. "It's been a night." The man gave a small nod, his face softening. "Sometimes they are," he replied simply. "Do you have a drink?" I asked bluntly, more out of instinct than expectation. He sighed, shaking his head. "You've had enough, son. You don't need more of that to figure out what you need to do." I let out a short laugh, devoid of humor. "What I need to do? You have no idea." "You're right," he said, his voice calm. "But sitting in the rain with a bottle isn't going to solve it either." The weight of his words hit harder than I expected. Without another word, I stepped past him, determined to walk off the edge that had been creeping closer all night. The drizzle turned into a steady rain as I found myself at a nearby bridge. Beneath, it was a small makeshift shelter cobbled together from discarded materials. The old man followed quietly, gesturing for me to sit under the dry cover. "You'll catch your death out here," he said, shaking his head. I sat on the edge of the shelter, staring out at the rain as it pelted the river below. The soft sound of the man unpacking his bag mixed with the rhythmic patter of rain. My mind wasn't on the present. It was on Vanessa and the images I'd seen earlier. Each picture replayed in my mind like a cruel slideshow. The old man handed me a folded blanket. "It's not much, but it'll keep you warm." "Thanks," I muttered, taking it reluctantly. He didn't press me to talk, didn't ask any questions. Instead, he began to hum a quiet tune as he cast a fishing line into the water. The sound was oddly calming, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. By the time the first light of morning broke through the clouds, I stirred, my head pounding from the whiskey. I stepped outside the makeshift shelter, my boots squelching in the damp earth. The old man was still there, his fishing line steady in the water. "Rough night," he said with a knowing smile. "You could say that," I replied, my voice hoarse. "Thanks for not asking." He shrugged. "Sometimes people just need a place to sit and think. Words can come later." I watched him for a moment, his calm presence a stark contrast to the storm I'd been battling internally. Maybe he was right. Maybe the answers weren't in the noise, but in the quiet moments when the storm passed. I'd let the night take its toll, but the day ahead was mine to command. With a nod to the old man, I walked away, the sun breaking through the clouds as I made my way back home. There were decisions to be made, and I intended to make them with clarity. Vanessa had chosen her path. Now it was time to choose mine. Taken aback by the old man's warmth, I blinked a few times, struggling to recall how I had ended up in his makeshift shelter. My voice was raspy when I finally spoke. "How did I get here?" The man chuckled softly, his expression kind but weathered. "You had a bit too much to drink last night, son. Found you passed out on the pavement. Couldn't leave you there in the rain, so I brought you here." Embarrassment heated my face, but I managed to thank him. "I hope I didn't cause too much trouble," I said, brushing off the dampness from my coat. The man leaned back, his fishing rod steady in the water. The sunlight danced off his weathered eyes as he replied, "You were a bit loud, especially with all that shouting about your wife." His words struck me like a jab, though his tone carried no malice. The weight of last night's revelations pressed down on me again. "Yeah," I said quietly. "It's been a rough time, The old man nodded slowly, his gaze steady but understanding. We've all been there. Grief, betrayal, loss. They come for us all at some point. But here's the thing about pain. It's got its own way of healing, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time. I gave a small nod, unsure of what to say. His words, simple as they were, carried a weight that demanded reflection. Before I could think too deeply, he shifted the conversation. For now, though, how about some breakfast? My stomach, growling as if on cue, made the decision for me. That would be great, I said, though my head was still pounding. Any chance you have something for this headache? The man grinned, his expression almost mischievous. Got just the thing. Soon, the rich aroma of simmering fish soup filled the air. I watched him work with an ease and precision that came only from years of practice. Smells incredible, I said honestly. He winked. Old family recipe. Best thing for mornings like these. We ate in companionable silence under the open sky. The warmth of the soup seemed to do more than ease my headache. It brought a strange sense of comfort I hadn't felt in weeks. As we finished, the old man broke the quiet. You seem like a good man, he said, his tone measured. But life's messy. Sometimes you just got to let go and move forward, especially when someone's shown you they're not worth the weight you're carrying for them. His words hit home, though I could see a flicker of sadness in his own eyes. Whatever story he carried, he kept it to himself. I didn't press, instead choosing to thank him for his generosity. You've been more help than you realize, I said honestly. I should get going. As I stood to leave, something near the shack caught my eye. Intricate wooden figures and carvings lined the ground outside, their detail striking. Did you make these? I asked, stepping closer to admire them. The old man's eyes sparkled with pride as he nodded. Yeah, been carving for years. Helps me find peace. They're incredible, I said, meaning it. You've got real talent. A faint smile crossed his face, but he said nothing more. With a final nod of thanks, I left, my steps lighter than they had been in weeks. There was something about the old man's quiet strength that inspired me. By the time I reached home, I was resolved. It was time to stop dwelling on what Vanessa had done and focus on what I could build. I opened my computer, already forming a plan. Local furniture stores, custom designs, unique carvings. There were plenty of opportunities to pursue. Over the next week, I worked tirelessly, pitching ideas with a fire I hadn't felt in years. Exactly 1 week later, I decided to visit Jim's Riverside Shack again. I wanted to thank him, perhaps even commission one of his carvings. But when I arrived, the shack was quiet. His fishing rod and jacket lay neatly near the entrance, but there was no sign of him. My brow furrowed. Maybe he was out gathering wood or taking a walk. As I turned to leave, a small stone worked its way into my shoe, forcing me to stop. Irritated, I found a flat spot to sit and remove the offending pebble. But as I leaned down, I noticed something, or rather, someone in the distance. A lone figure stood at the edge of the bridge, his silhouette unmistakable. My stomach dropped as panic seized me. It was Jim. He was too close to the edge, and beside him, I spotted a coiled rope lying on the ground. Without thinking, I shot to my feet, ignoring the untied laces of my shoes. "Jim!" I shouted, my voice raw with urgency. "Step back. Just hold on." The bridge's wooden planks creaked beneath my pounding steps as I raced toward him. Each stride carried a silent prayer that I wouldn't be too late. My heart thundered in my chest as his figure came into focus, but the look in his eyes froze me in place. They were filled with a sorrow so deep, it felt like I could drown in it. "Jim, don't do this," I said, my voice steady but firm. "You don't have to face this alone." Jim's eyes met mine, brimming with pain and unshed tears. The anguish in his gaze spoke volumes, far louder than words ever could. I approached him slowly, deliberately, careful not to startle him or push him further into despair. When I reached him, I placed a firm but steady arm around his shoulders. "Jim," I said, my voice calm but commanding, "you're not alone in this." His body trembled under my touch, and the tears he'd been holding back finally broke free. He began to sob, the sound raw and unfiltered, and I pulled him into a firm embrace. It's okay, I murmured, my tone steady and sure. We'll face this together. For a long moment, we stood on that bridge, two men bound by an unspoken understanding of life struggles. When his breathing steadied, I guided him to sit with me on the edge of the bridge. The river below shimmered in the morning light, its gentle current a stark contrast to the turmoil Jim was feeling. With time, he began to talk. Slowly, piece by piece, Jim unraveled his story, the weight of his words heavy in the crisp morning air. He spoke of his years serving the country, then his job at a food processing plant. Work that was honest, if not glamorous. His voice faltered as he explained how he'd secured a small apartment and done everything possible to provide for his daughter, the light of his life. Jim rubbed his forehead as the memories spilled out. I lost the job when the plant downsized. Missed the rent. They evicted me a week later. After that, he paused, his hands fidgeting as he stared at the ground. After that, everything fell apart. His voice grew quieter as he spoke of returning to his hometown, hoping for a fresh start. But the lack of a permanent address and a history of job loss made him an easy target for rejection. Each door he tried to open seemed to slam shut in his face. I even got picked up for sleeping in places I wasn't supposed to, he admitted, his tone heavy with shame. I fell sick, and there was no help. Not for someone like me. Eventually, he stumbled upon the shack by the bridge, which had become his home. His voice cracked as he spoke of his daughter, the pain of knowing she likely thought he'd abandoned her. I didn't want her to see me like this, he said, tears brimming in his eyes again. I didn't want her to know what I'd become. Hearing his story stirred something deep within me. This wasn't just a man struggling to survive. This was a man who had fought hard and lost, time and time again, but still carried a spark of resilience. When we finally stood to walk back to the shack, I placed a hand on his shoulder, speaking with quiet conviction. Jim, life's thrown some hard punches your way, but you're still standing. You've got skills, experience, and a good heart. You're not in this alone anymore. Jim looked at me, his watery eyes filled with gratitude and surprise. I didn't wait for him to respond. My mind was already racing, forming a plan. I've been working on something, I said. You have talent, and I have a vision. Let's work together. We can start small cradles, maybe wooden furniture. We'll build something real, something that lasts. His eyes widened at the suggestion. You trust me with that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I met his gaze without hesitation. Jim, if I didn't trust you, I wouldn't have asked. Over the next 2 weeks, my garage became a workshop, alive with the sound of sawing, hammering, and laughter. Together, we poured our energy into crafting exquisite wooden cradles, each piece carrying the weight of our combined hope and determination. Jim wasn't just a guest in my home. He became family. We shared meals, stories, and dreams, forging a bond that neither of us had expected. The first batch of cradles was loaded into my truck and delivered to local furniture stores. Their intricate designs and expert craftsmanship immediately caught the attention of the store owners. One of them, impressed, asked about the craftsman behind the work. That would be my friend Jim, I said proudly. He's got an incredible gift. The cradles quickly gained popularity, customers drawn to their uniqueness and the care that went into making each one. As word spread, orders began pouring in, not just from the stores but directly from customers who had heard about the remarkable pieces. Orders continued to flood in, each one further solidifying the success of our small enterprise. One afternoon, as I organized our next shipment, my phone buzzed with a familiar name on the screen, Vanessa. For a moment, I hesitated, memories flashing through my mind. Still, I answered, my tone neutral. The conversation was brief. Vanessa mentioned that her trip abroad had been delayed and might last longer than expected. Then came the unexpected. She hesitantly asked for a loan. I paused, processing her sudden request, but my decision was already clear. Vanessa, I said firmly, I'm sorry, but I can't do that right now. Her irritation was immediate. She let out an audible sigh before snapping, fine. Forget it. Then the line went dead. I stared at the phone for a moment, but the sting I might have felt months ago was absent. The conversation only strengthened my resolve to focus on the people who truly mattered and the future I was building. Back at the workshop, Jim and I faced a new challenge. Our space was becoming too small to handle the growing demand for our cradles. I remembered a conversation with an old friend, Mark, who mentioned owning a vacant barn just outside of town. Spacious, sturdy, and in use for years, it seemed perfect for our needs. The transition to the barn was seamless. We hired a few eager local workers who were excited to learn the craft and be part of our growing success. I took on a more managerial role, overseeing operations from my home office, while Jim became a mentor to the new recruits, teaching them the precision and patience required for woodworking. One evening, Jim returned home after a long day at the barn. As he stepped into the house, he looked surprised to find me in the kitchen, moving about with purpose. Normally, we shared simple meals with the crew before wrapping up the day, but tonight was different. The table was neatly set, and the air was filled with the aroma of a carefully prepared dinner. "Take a seat, Jim," I said, smiling warmly. "Dinner's almost ready." Though confused, he complied, his eyes watching me curiously as I moved about. When I finally joined him at the table, I removed my apron and grinned, the anticipation in my eyes catching his attention. "I hope you won't be upset, Jim," I began, my voice tinged with excitement. Before he could ask what I meant, the doorbell rang. I got up to answer it, and a moment later, a young woman hesitantly stepped inside, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. A small girl clung to her hand, her curious gaze taking everything in. Jim froze as recognition dawned on him. His face turned pale, then flushed with emotion. He stood abruptly, stumbling slightly as he rushed toward the young woman. "Mindy," he choked out, his voice trembling. "Mindy!" Tears streamed down her face as she stepped forward and embraced him tightly. "I thought I'd never see you again, Dad," she whispered through sobs. Jim held her, as if afraid to let go. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I should have reached out," he said, his voice breaking. "You should have, Dad," Mindy replied softly, stroking his hair. "But it's okay now. We're here." Jim's gaze shifted to the small girl standing beside Mindy, her big eyes watching everything with fascination. "Kristen," Mindy said, smiling through her tears. "Dad, this is your granddaughter." Jim knelt, his hands shaking as he reached out to Kristen. "Hi," he said, his voice filled with wonder. Kristen smiled shyly, stepping forward to hug him. I clapped my hands gently to draw their attention. "Dinner's ready, everyone," I announced. "Let's eat." As we gathered around the table, laughter and warmth filled the room. Mindy shared the story of her journey to find her father, recounting how her determination had strained her relationship with her husband, ultimately leading to their separation. Despite the challenges, she felt a sense of peace and closure being reunited with Jim. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of joy. Mindy and Kristen stayed with us, their presence bringing a lively energy to the house. I could see the healing effect they had on Jim, and it was equally uplifting for me. One evening, while I was engrossed in paperwork in my home office, the front door creaked open. It wasn't Jim or Mindy. They always announced their return cheerfully. I glanced out and saw Vanessa standing in the doorway, her shoulders slumped and dark circles under her eyes. She dropped her bags and collapsed onto the living room sofa, sighing heavily. "That trip was an experience," she said to no one in particular. I stepped out of the office and stood silently, watching her. Her movements were weary, a shadow of the woman I once knew. Taking a deep breath, I approached and sat beside her, keeping a deliberate distance. Vanessa glanced at me, trying to gauge my mood. "Robert," she began cautiously, "I know things have been complicated." I raised a hand, cutting her off. "Vanessa," I said, my voice low but firm, "did you have your phone sync turned off?" Her brows furrowed in confusion, but as realization dawned, her eyes widened in shock. "Robert," she stammered, "I can explain. I saw the photos," I said, my tone even, "and I don't need to see more to understand." She moved closer, desperation creeping into her voice. "Please, Robert, it's not what it looks like. Just let me explain." I stood abruptly, putting space between us. "I wish I hadn't seen those photos, Vanessa." But now that I have, things will never be the same. I can't, and I won't, pretend everything's okay. Her voice trembled. Just give me a chance to explain. I shook my head, my decision final. It's best if you leave. Vanessa's frustration bubbled over. So this is it, she snapped. You won't even hear me out? Fine. Leave, but don't forget. No one will ever stand by you like I did. No one will love you like I did. The sound of the front door opening interrupted the tense moment. Jim entered, took one look at the scene, and quietly retreated, sensing the gravity of the situation. Vanessa's anger faltered, replaced by a sorrowful expression. I'm truly sorry, Robert, she whispered. I nodded, acknowledging her words. I appreciate the apology, but it's time for you to go. As Vanessa left, Kristen ran across the yard, giggling as she played. She saw me and hugged my legs tightly, her innocence and joy contrasting sharply with the storm Vanessa had left behind. For the first time in a long time, I felt a deep sense of clarity. Vanessa paused at the gate, her gaze lingering on the scene. Something in her expression shifted, as if realizing what she had lost. Then she turned and walked away. Inside the house, laughter and warmth awaited me, a future I was determined to embrace.